Hi everyone! Throughout this unit, we've focused on the biodiversity of ecosystems. We've thought about genetic diversity, species diversity, and habitat diversity. Today, we're going to think about species diversity because what we're going to cover is ecological succession, which is related to how the composition of species within a community changes over time. Ecological succession is the predictable replacement of one group of species by another group of species over time. So we're really thinking about the process by which an ecological community changes over time. This can happen over weeks to centuries, depending on what that community is starting out with. There's two types of ecological succession that we're going to look at: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession occurs on surfaces with bare rock and no soil. And that's really the key for you to remember, is that primary succession, we don't have any soil developed yet. This can occur in several different areas, anywhere where you've got bare rock exposed, but some examples are when you have rock that gets exposed after a glacier has retreated. What's really cool about this upper right photo is you can see in the past we had this glacier that extended really far into this valley, whereas now that glacier really only exists in the upper portion, which would be this portion of the photo. So you can see that as the glacier has retreated, it's exposed new rock, which will eventually undergo this primary succession process. Primary succession can also occur in areas that have been freshly covered with lava after a volcanic eruption, or even urban areas like abandoned parking lots. Really anywhere that you've got cement laid down can be the start of primary succession if left alone for long enough. Primary succession has some fairly predictable steps that we can look at. The first one is that bare rock is actually colonized by pioneer species, and those species are things like algae, lichen, and moss, and they do not require any soil. So pioneer species will then excrete acids that break down the rock. We can also call this chemical weathering. There's other types of chemical weathering, but this is an example of that process. And what's really cool about these pioneer species is that by doing that acid secretion, that allows the moss, lichen, algae to wear away at the rock's surface and to actually get nutrients directly from the rock. So that's why they don't need soil, is because they can actually access nutrients that's been locked away from other plants. When those pioneer species die, they'll begin to decompose, and over periods of time, they will start to create the first layer of soil. As those pioneer species continue to grow, die, then decompose, that soil will build up over time until eventually it's deep enough, it's rich enough to support plants that have deeper or larger root systems. We call these plants that come in next mid-successional plants. Those are things like grasses and wildflowers. Grasses and wildflowers are generally easily dispersed, so that means that their seeds can be carried by the wind, they can be carried in bird droppings, in other droppings from animals, and then that's how they get introduced into these areas. Those mid-successional plants will continue to grow, they'll die and decompose as well, which will further improve the soil. So this process is really dependent on the depth and nutrient richness of the soil in the area. Once that soil has developed enough to support larger organisms, those mid-successional plants will eventually be outcompeted by shrubs and trees. And the first shrubs and trees that will come into the area to begin growing are ones that are easily dispersed by the wind or bird droppings. Also, those organisms will grow well in full sun. As those shrubs and trees grow, we're producing more shade, and eventually it becomes so shady that new seedlings of those first shrubs and trees that require lots of sunlight will not be able to survive. And when that happens, those plants will start to become outcompeted by shade-tolerant trees like many species of beech and maple. So over time, we see that in primary succession and ecological succession as a whole, we go from really small, quick-growing plants to eventually these really beautiful climax communities that have a lot of biodiversity. And that's another word that I want to point out. A climax community is kind of that mature, well-developed group of organisms that exists at the end of primary succession. So that is something that you should know. So with this slide, I kind of just want to pull all of those steps together in primary succession. So this is again Primary succession, we are starting with exposed rock. Over time, lichens and mosses will come in. Those are our pioneer species. They'll secrete acids, wear away at those rock surfaces, and as those pioneer species die, they decompose and start to form soil. Eventually, we have these mid-successional plants. So these are our mid-successional plants. Those are wildflowers and grasses. They'll come in once that soil has been developed, and eventually those will be replaced by shrubs. They'll be replaced by trees that are sun tolerant, and eventually we'll get to our shade tolerant trees like beech and maple, trees that have really big leaves that can absorb lots of sunlight. And once we get to this kind of end stage, I again just want to make sure that I've given you this term, climax community. All right, then secondary succession is ecological succession that occurs in areas that have been disturbed but have not actually lost their soil. So that's the difference between primary and secondary succession. With secondary succession, we are starting with a relatively established soil. This can happen after disturbances like forest fires, which will burn through an area and effectively kill most of those plant species that were living there, but it leaves the soil there and accessible still. Hurricanes and floods are also examples of disturbances that can affect the plant life and animal life, but will leave soil relatively intact. Secondary succession follows very similar steps as primary succession, except it doesn't start with that bare rock and pioneer species. So we have soil intact already. So in secondary succession, we see this process actually begins with rapid colonization by easily dispersed plants. And these are our grasses and our wildflowers. So things that can get there quickly by wind dispersion or by birds dropping seeds when they excrete waste. This process will then follow the same sequential steps as in primary succession. We've talked about species richness as a measurement of biodiversity, and we're also going to look at total biomass and productivity. The general trends that we see are that ecological succession increases species richness, which initially increases biomass and primary productivity. Over time, once we have our established climax community, we see some general trends related to these three factors. So as succession occurs, more and more plant species are introduced into an area because we're moving from pioneer species or grasses and wildflowers to that climax community that has mature trees and increased biodiversity. And when that is happening, we're also creating new areas that can support a wider variety of animal and insect species. So a community that's well developed, that has a variety of grasses, wildflowers, trees, shrubs, that can support or has room for more different species, as opposed to an area that's just bare rock and lichen or just grasses and wildflowers. Once we reach our climax community, we've got our mature trees that have grown in the area, we'll see species richness plateau. As we do get more and larger species introduced into the area through the process of ecological succession, we see an increase in biomass. Again, this will also eventually plateau once the climax community has been formed. At that stage of ecological succession, we don't have new organisms that are rapidly growing to fill up an empty space. Instead, we have more established organisms like trees that increase in biomass much more slowly. Although we see an initial increase in primary productivity at the beginning of ecological succession, as you get towards late succession, so getting towards that climax community, we see that the community consists of a lot more long-lived, slower-growing species like trees, even larger shrubs, and those have a lot slower or lower photosynthetic rates than early successional species. Let's shift slightly away from ecological succession and think about two other species that have a huge impact on species diversity. The first of those is called a keystone species, which is a species that is not very abundant, but has large effects on an ecological community. So there's a few examples I'm going to go through. A beaver is a great example of a keystone species. They live in North American forests. They account for a very, very small amount of the total biomass in these areas. However, they play a really critical role in their communities. What beavers do is they build dams and these dams block the flow of water and they convert small streams into large ponds. What that does is creates new habitats that then support a really diverse group of species. And keystone species can be predators, prey, or they can provide some other type of essential service. Another type of keystone species is a sea star. We see these all along our coastline. They're keystone species for rocky intertidal communities, particularly up in Washington. When sea stars are present, they eat mussels, which is super important because when mussel populations are kept low, that means there's space for other species to live in the area. When sea stars are removed from the community, mussels will quickly outcompete all of the rest of the species for space and create communities that have extremely low biodiversity. So in this graph on the slide, we can see that when we have this keystone species present, and this is looking particularly at sea stars versus mussels, or sea stars and their impact on these intertidal ecosystems. When keystone predators, because sea stars eat mussels, are present, the number of species is much higher. It's almost up to 20 in some cases, but it's hovering between 12 and 20 species total. When our sea stars are removed, we see a sharp decrease and then really low numbers of other species in the area. So sea stars, there's not a ton of them, but they have a huge impact. And when they're removed, the biodiversity of the area decreases really sharply. The last example I want to give you is in the South Pacific Islands, we have the species of bat that's commonly referred to as a flying fox. They are the only known pollinators for hundreds of tropical plant species. So there's tons of examples, and there's all different types of keystone species. Again, they don't have to be a predator. They can be a pollinator. They can be kind of an ecosystem engineer like a beaver, but they're small in number in general, and they have a huge impact. Last thing to cover is the idea of an indicator species. I'm going to give you two definitions. The first one is from your textbook. The second one I think I prefer, so you're welcome to write down either of those in your notes. But an indicator species is a species that demonstrates a particular characteristic of an ecosystem. The definition that I prefer is a plant or animal that by its presence, abundance, or scarcity can indicate the health of an ecosystem or the presence of certain environmental conditions. So if we look at this top bar up here, what this shows is several different macroinvertebrates. And those are organisms that are generally considered indicator species. What these specific macroinvertebrates will show is when they're present, they can indicate different levels of pollution. If we have all of those indicator species present, that means our pollution levels are probably fairly low. They're probably good. If we see all of these macroinvertebrates have died except for sludge worms, that suggests that our pollution levels are fairly high. So indicator species can be used to check for the health of an ecosystem over time. So if you're looking at a specific pond, for example, that should have stonefly nymphs and dragonfly nymphs and freshwater shrimp, and then we see those disappear or really drastically reduce in number, that's generally an indicator that something is going wrong in that particular area. Another example that should hit pretty close to home is amphibians. Amphibians are indicator species because they have some very specific adaptations. Their skin is actually a site of respiration and water absorption. So that means that they can take in gases through their skin and they can also take in water. So that means if there's pollution in the air or if there's pollution in the water, they'll both affect amphibians. So they're particularly sensitive. One that you should probably know is called the tiger salamander. You'll hear about this, especially in Sonoma County. Our tiger salamanders are endangered right now, and so there's a lot of work to try to restore ecosystems so that they're healthy, so that we can bring back these populations of amphibians. These are your two practice FRQs for section 2.7. In this first one, I'm really wanting you to think about the sequence of events that occurs during whichever type of succession we're looking at in this photo. So I want you to determine if it's primary or secondary, and then talk me through the steps that would occur after that initial disturbance. And then the second is an opportunity for you to practice some dimensional analysis.